In the diverse landscape of political and ethical thought, Niccolo Machiavelli and Reinhold Niebuhr stand as two influential figures, each emerging from distinct historical and intellectual backgrounds. Machiavelli, a Renaissance diplomat and philosopher, navigated the politically tumultuous landscape of 16th century Italy, which shaped his pragmatic approach to statecraft and power in The Prince. In contrast, Niebuhr was a 20th century American theologist and ethicist who often grappled with the moral complexities of human nature and justice within the broader context of Christian theology. This essay seeks to compare these two thinkers, ultimately, Machiavelli and Niebuhr, and try to see if we can come to some interesting and unique conclusions that can be found from both of their collective works, particularly The Prince and Niebuhr's article on why the church cannot be pacifist. This essay is seeking to explore the connection between Machiavelli's practical approach to power and Niebuhr's thoughts on ethics and morality within humanity. Ultimately, the main goal is to try to combine Machiavelli's observations to come to some greater conclusion involved with both thinkers. So, in reading both works, I think the fundamental overlap that can be found between both Machiavelli and Niebuhr can be found in their shared recognition on the ultimate futility of striving for moral perfection, particularly within the realm of politics. Niebuhr in particular is adamant that moral virtue in collective institutions such as governments or businesses is an impossibility. In his writings on why the church is not pacifist, Niebuhr asserts that the political sphere is ultimately incapable of adhering to the moral principles of Christ. Niebuhr argues that governments are inherently evil and can only express self-interest. According to Niebuhr, throughout history, Christians did not give themselves to the illusion that they had discovered a method for eliminating the element of conflict from political strategies. On the contrary, the political problem and task were specifically disavowed by Christians. In general, Niebuhr's viewpoint suggests that the world of politics is intrinsically beyond redemption through Christian ethics, and any attempt to eradicate conflict from politics is ultimately futile. In a similar vein, Machiavelli posits a viewpoint that somewhat mirrors that in The Prince, asserting that political success often necessitates actions that diverge from conventional morality. To Machiavelli, if a ruler wishes to reach his highest goals, he will not find it rational to be moral. Machiavelli even warns that a man that wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him amongst so much that is evil. To Machiavelli, there's just a clear difference between the way the world is and the way the world should be. And he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. When discussing a leader's need to adopt brutality as a means of accomplishing one's goals, Machiavelli states that if men were entirely good, this precept would not hold, but because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are bound to observe it with them. The ultimate argumentation from Machiavelli is that the evil of man is what prevents a ruler from being able to effectively exercise virtue in all aspects of leadership. Due to the fact that evil exists in this world, humans, must ultimately succumb in part to this evil in order to survive. This perspective is mirrored through Niebuhr as well, who claims that because men are sinners, justice can only be achieved by a certain degree of coercion. Niebuhr describes man's attempts to emulate the moral perfection of Christ as an impossible possibility. Indeed, loyalty to Christ means realization with intention, but does not actually mean the full realization of the measure of Christ. To Niebuhr, there is an understanding that humans will always fall short of the perfect image of morality proposed by Christ, and that any effort made to administer justice within the flawed tapestry of human interactions necessitates the use of force. At the time these assertions made by Niebuhr were being used to combat the law of love argument being used by many Christian pacifist groups of the era. Nevertheless, this philosophy being proposed, particularly as it relates to man's proclivity towards supposed sinful acts, has clear assertions here to arguments made by Machiavelli on what constitutes effective leadership. Both men believe that the ultimate moral imperfections of man necessitate that any practical applications of political efforts will always fall short of what many ascribe as virtue. To Niebuhr, this even exists in everyday life for the individual as well. Both believe that to succeed in power requires one to compromise on one's morals and, according to Niebuhr, act in defiance to Christ. Machiavelli's The Prince, unlike Niebuhr's article, is largely concerned with providing grounded and practical approaches to both life and politics. Indeed, this practical perspective is reflected in the book's approach to philosophy, particularly as it relates to morality. In The Prince, Machiavelli advocates that a leader can and should seek out power through less than morally righteous means, so long as the ends justify the means. Machiavelli's commentaries on the leadership style of Hannibal Barca provide an excellent example of this viewpoint. In these commentaries, Machiavelli admits that Barca was quite feared by his soldiers due to his cruelty. However, this cruelty was justified in the end, as it was only through instilling fear that Hannibal could unite his soldiers and prevent infighting among the ranks. Through this, Hannibal was able to effectively use his armies to capture the Italian peninsula and surrounding countryside. To Machiavelli, without that cruelty, his other virtues were not sufficient to produce this effect. Generally, Machiavelli's perspective is that the cruelty exercised by Barca was required in order to achieve greater virtue and success. Likely the greatest example of Machiavelli's ends justify the means perspective can be found in chapter 17 of The Prince, concerning cruelty and clemency, which delves even further into Machiavelli's outlook on moral compromises. In this chapter, Machiavelli contrasts the leadership style of 15th century Italian nobleman Cesare Borgia with the clement and kind leadership style of the Florentines. According to Machiavelli, Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Notwithstanding, his cruelty reconciled the Romagna, unified it, and restored it to peace and loyalty. The Florentines, on the other hand, through exercising clemency and seeking to avoid a reputation for cruelty, permitted Pistoia to be destroyed. To Machiavelli, since Borgia's cruelty led his people to peace and prosperity, he will be seen to have been much more merciful than the Florentines' people. A leader, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal, ought not to mind the reproach of cruelty, because, with a few examples, he will be more merciful than those who, through too much mercy, allow disorder to arise. In this context, Machiavelli is suggesting that a ruler's actions, which might be deemed cruel or morally questionable, can be justified if they lead to a desirable outcome, such as stability and peace for the state. Ultimately, a fluid and dynamic interpretation of morality can be observed in Machiavelli's The Prince, where the morally correct action in present circumstances may not prove beneficial in the long term. In contrast to Machiavelli, Niebuhr maintains a far more rigid stance on moral righteousness, condemning the inherent sinfulness found in politics. Niebuhr does not give in to the idea that moral goodness can be exercised in less than righteous means. While Niebuhr accepts the inevitability of moral compromises in politics, he does not forgive them. In fact, to Niebuhr, even just participating in acts related to power are sinful. To Niebuhr, entering the kingdom of God can only be accomplished through disavowing the political task. Even the common individual uninvolved in the machinations of politics is guilty, according to Niebuhr, as the sins of pride and lust for power and the consequent tyranny and injustice are all present in individual life. Therefore, even existing in a state where power games are present makes one incapable of living up to the standards set by Christ. Niebuhr elaborates on the individual's inevitable path to sin through his discussion on humanity's anxieties in the context of faith. Human anxieties, likened by Niebuhr as a well-forged ally between ego and insecurity, is what renders man incapable of living without sin. All humans are guilty of anxiety to Niebuhr, not necessarily just those in power. Niebuhr describes how even a modest preacher is guilty of this anxiety, as he will ultimately find himself anxious about his job, anxious about delivering a perfect sermon, anxious about his prestige, even anxious about his reputation as a righteous man. Ultimately, through trying to satisfy these anxieties, the preacher will inevitably be driven towards a need for acquiring some sort of power or prestige. He will equate control for peace and authority for self-worth. Therefore, while both Niebuhr and Machiavelli acknowledge the imperfections inherent in human nature and the practice of politics, their approaches to reconciling these imperfections fundamentally differ. Machiavelli deems the outcome of moral compromise in politics as forgivable so long as it serves a greater good, while Niebuhr condemns this reality, believing that through the existence of power games and anxieties present within individuals, every human is in some sense guilty of sin. This, Niebuhr likens, is the ultimate tragedy of humanity, that desires to satisfy anxieties will ultimately lead humans to a path of sinfulness. In concluding this comparison, it must be addressed that much of these differences in perspective between both scholars certainly take root in the fundamentally different purposes and structure of their literary works. Machiavelli's views on morality in The Prince are being used in a pragmatic context to provide valuable insights into understanding and achieving political success. Niebuhr, however, is addressing the concept of morality in a more theoretical, individual context, focused less on actions or outcomes and more on the human element. These different contexts no doubt affect their respective attitudes and approaches to qualifying what morality is. Regardless, it remains important and relevant to contrast both perspectives, especially as the interplay between both philosophies can result in even greater conclusions. So the notion previously brought up and described regarding Niebuhr's anxieties raises an interesting outcome and narrative, especially if it can be related now to Machiavelli's discussion on the fox and the lion present in chapter 18 of The Prince. According to Machiavelli in this chapter, there are two ways of contesting, the one by the law and the other by force. The first method proper to man and the second method proper to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse to the second. Therefore, Machiavelli argues it is necessary for a prince to understand how to avail himself of the beast and the man, like a centaur. In particular, a prince ought to choose the fox and the lion. Machiavelli is ultimately proposing here that the realm of power ultimately lends itself to often adopting behaviors more typical of beasts such as lions or foxes. Taking a more literal stance here, this could be interpreted as saying that to succeed in the world of power, one must occasionally abandon the qualities typically associated with humanity, such as ration or reason or governance or law, in favor of more aggressive and primal qualities likened to beasts. Basically, power sometimes necessitates adopting animalistic traits in order to avoid being tied down by the laws that traditionally govern man. Therefore, juxtaposed with Niebuhr's discussion of anxieties, a narrative can be seen and interpreted. Ultimately, it is man's anxieties which render him subservient to play along in the games of power, and within these games, one must adopt traits traditionally observed within animals and beasts in order to succeed. As a result, it could be argued here that man's ultimate drawback from preventing him from acting in exact accordance with the ideals of Christ are his purveying animalistic traits, present most notably in the realm of power, that, according to both Niebuhr and Machiavelli, is a realm that inevitably goes against all understandings of morality. Of course, Machiavelli encourages this outcome and teaches his followers to learn to become the proper kind of beast, whereas Niebuhr teaches that this form of animalistic behavior or anxieties is intrinsically a deviation of Christ-like behavior and is sinful. In summary, comparing Machiavelli and Niebuhr helps us understand the ethical challenges in leadership today and in the past. Niebuhr ultimately sees human mistakes as naturally sinful, critiquing our flaws, while Machiavelli takes a more understanding, realistic stance, acknowledging that practical needs can lead us away from being morally right. While both definitely acknowledge that people are in some way incapable of living up to some moral perfections, their understandings and reactions to these things are very much so different. And of course, this makes sense given their background. Machiavelli was a political writer of the time who was advocating for pragmatic approaches to leadership, whereas Niebuhr is very much so a theoretical theologian discussing human morality in the context of a very Christian stance. It's understandable why these perspectives would differ, but it's still interesting to talk about. Really, why do you think that Niebuhr views these as inherently sinful? Why is he so hard on humans, basically? If these aspirations of morality are admittedly unrealistic, then is it even our fault? Machiavelli offers a more forgiving perspective here, but even he admits that these types of behaviors are a deviation from what is morally right. So both admit that as people, we are inherently flawed and will inevitably break the moral codes that we've created. But if this is the case, that this moral code is unattainable, then is it really our fault as humans for not being able to attain it? Or is it the moral code that is unattainable that is at fault? Are these animal behaviors or anxieties really deviations from the human psyche like described by Machiavelli or Niebuhr? Or are these just normal aspects of the human psyche that we've decided are different or bad in preventing moral righteousness? Of course, this essay is not trying to argue here that morality or moral codes are false or fictional by any means, and it's important to understand that Machiavelli and Niebuhr's understandings of morality and human sin are theoretical and not absolute or objective. But it is interesting to look at how both of these people acknowledge that humans are incapable of living up to morality, and both see this as a flaw in humans. Furthermore, it should be mentioned that neither the stances of Machiavelli or Niebuhr should be treated as objective here. It should be acknowledged that Machiavelli's perspectives are frequently critiqued, particularly with regards to their malicious and often brutal outlook on morality. Likewise, Niebuhr's views on original sin should not deter any individual from seeking virtue in life, nor should it be interpreted as excusing the many atrocities that do happen in the realm of power. In the end, morality is a difficult concept to tie down, but through exploring Machiavelli and through Niebuhr, we can come to a greater understanding of what it means to be morally righteous in this political world.